In our module introduction, we talked about how great PMs create leverage by using their product intuition to make great product decisions in the absence of detailed information. However, there are two major challenges most PMs run into that hold them back from effectively developing product intuition. They are friction in building good feedback immersion habits and overweighing recency of feedback when evaluating feedback importance. To solve these challenges, we talked about how great PMs set up feedback management systems that automate the collection and processing of feedback from multiple sources. In the previous lesson, we covered the first of those systems, feedback rivers. Feedback rivers solve the first two challenges: friction in establishing a regular feedback immersion habit and challenges in maintaining a direct understanding of the user. In this lesson, we'll introduce a tool to solve the third challenge. This tool is called the Feedback System of Record. A feedback system of record, FSOR, is a system for quantitatively tracking your feature requests over time. At its most basic, here's how an FSOR works. As feedback comes in with specific feature requests, those feature requests are added to the FSOR. And if the feature request already exists, the number of votes for that particular feature is increased. The FSOR differs from the feedback river in two key ways: structural tracking and less qualitative detail. First, the FSOR structurally tracks how often a feature has been requested. When feedback comes in, if it has a feature request, the FSOR updates itself on how often that feature has been requested. In contrast, the feedback river does not keep a running count of how often a feature has been asked for. Second, the FSOR stores less qualitative detail. When a feature request comes in, the FSOR only updates itself on how often it's been requested. In other words, the FSOR does not store the original user verbatim and context behind the feature request. The feedback river stores the full original user verbatim, allowing the PM to better understand the context behind a feature request. As a result of these differences, the feedback system of record is much more uniquely suited to help PMs solve their third challenge in developing product intuition: overweighting recent feedback. Recall that recency bias is the tendency to overweigh recent feedback. In other words, PMs may erroneously think a feature is requested more often than it actually is, just because it was requested more recently and is fresher in their mind. The problem is that the PM's perceived importance of a feature doesn't match the objective importance for it, which leads to suboptimal feature prioritization decisions. The FSOR helps the PM avoid this trap by being an objective record of how often features really are requested. To illustrate this, recall the hypothetical Bumble example we talked about earlier. Without an FSOR, Bumble PMs might not have realized the requests for video profile pictures aren't objectively as requested as matchmaking improvements, and made a suboptimal prioritization choice. So we know that FSOR are important for mitigating recency bias. Next, let's talk about how to set up an FSOR. Setting up your FSOR is a three-step process. Determine your FSOR platform, set up your FSOR, and regularly update your FSOR with feedback input. Let's walk through this three-step process in sequence. The third step tends to be the most complex, so we'll spend the most time there when we get to it. Your first step is to determine what platform you want to use for your SOR. Any software that allows you to track data in a structured way will generally work as an FSOR. Some common platforms used are Google Sheets, Trello, and Jira. If your users are particularly engaged, you can also consider using a public-facing feedback software like Canny, which allows users to directly upvote and submit feature requests. We recommend choosing your platform based on what you feel will be easiest to update for your organization, because keeping the FSOR up to date is one of the most challenging parts of maintaining a useful FSOR. If most of your feature requests are submitted through customer support, for instance, then you may want to make the FSOR the same as the system that customer support uses. At LinkedIn, spreadsheets ended up being the simplest platform for their main sources of feature requests, customer support and sales, to update, so they ran with that. For Notejoy, they decided to use a public-facing feedback tracker for their FSOR because their users were highly active and regularly submitted feature requests directly. Your second step is to set up your FSOR with the fields you want to track. The key fields that an FSOR needs to track are the feature request, short description of what it is, number of requests received, and current status of the feature request, resolved, in progress, deprioritized, or open. For B2B companies, you also will usually need to track the following fields: type of user requesting the feature, end user or business decision maker. End users are the people who use the software day to day. Business decision makers are the people who don't use the software day to day, but hold the buying power for the software. Current spend from the requesting user's business, and potential spend from the requesting user's business. It's useful to track these fields for B2B because you often need to weigh feedback differently depending on who's asking for a feature. For example, it's often most important to satisfy the business decision maker's requirements before the end users because they hold the buying power. Similarly, if you have a large customer or potential customer, you likely will need to prioritize their feedback over other smaller customers. A shell FSOR template is provided in the Reforge Feedback System of Record template. Finally, in the most difficult part of the process, set up a regular updating process for the FSOR. Most PMs struggle with this step because they don't have a good system to manage all the disparate sources of input they get. Feedback requests often come from multiple sources in unstructured data formats. Manually reading through data and then updating the FSOR for each feedback input is extremely time-consuming. As a result, the FSOR ends up not being updated, losing its value as a source of truth for how requested a feature really is. To solve this problem, great PMs create a system where the teams responsible for each feedback source update the FSOR. Since these teams already have someone assigned to reading through the feedback source, it's much less of an incremental lift to parse out key feedback requests to update the FSOR with. There are 3 major challenges to successfully leveraging other teams, though: maintaining FSOR data cleanliness, managing product champion capacity, and motivating other teams to tag the feedback into the hierarchy. The first challenge is maintaining the FSOR's data cleanliness. Teams that process the feedback sources won't necessarily know the product as well as you do. As a result, they might inadvertently create multiple feature requests, all termed slightly differently for the same underlying feature request. For example, they might create 3 different entries: mobile save, on-the-go note creation, browser one-click save, for the same feature request: web clipper. To solve this, have a single designated product champion from each team be responsible for updating the FSOR. This will generally be the same product champion you chose to handle your manual feedback sources in the Feedback River setup process. Having one person in charge of updating the FSOR allows them to build up knowledge of what feature requests are being tracked in the FSOR. This is beneficial because they know what feature requests already exist in the FSOR and the alternative names that they often go by. As a result, they are much more likely to avoid creating a duplicate new feature request. Additionally, having one person in charge of the FSOR has an added efficiency benefit. As a product champion repeatedly sees certain feature requests over and over, they can begin to more efficiently distinguish when a certain piece of feedback is related to an existing request. If you've elected to have a public-facing FSORs where users can directly create and upvote feature requests, you will also need a community moderator. At its most basic level, the community moderator is a designated person to maintain FSOR hygiene. Users won't always look for existing feature requests to upvote before creating a new one. As a result, you need a community moderator to help with merging duplicate feature requests. If the moderator has capacity, they should also maintain community relations. They should let users know that their feedback has been received and help communicate the relative priority level of certain feature requests. This helps users feel like they're being heard, which keeps them continually contributing. At the start, you will likely need to designate a person from your organization to handle these tasks. Over time, certain users will emerge as particularly passionate and knowledgeable about your product, at which point you can appoint them as moderators. This practice is seen in Microsoft user forums, where there are both Microsoft-employed full-time moderators and passionate user moderators. The second challenge is managing your product champion's capacity. Often, your product champion won't be able to dedicate all their time to processing feedback into FSOR updates. As a result, you have to efficiently prioritize the work that they can do. This challenge is most applicable for product champions from customer support teams, as they tend to have the most feedback volume to read through. Efficiently prioritizing work means making sure the feedback they spend time reading through and categorizing into feature requests are representative of the most requested features. You can help them identify what features are most requested by creating a categorization system for feature requests. A categorization system is a system for sorting objects into different areas based on their attributes. For an example categorization system, consider the Dewey Decimal System, used in most libraries. It breaks up books into several major topic areas, from religion to science. Then, within each topic area, it divides books up by subtopic. For example, within the social sciences topic area, it has subtopics like statistics, economics, law, and several others. Applying this idea to the FSOR, the idea is to ask teams to categorize feedback into broad feature areas as they're processing it. For example, as the customer support team responds to tickets, they label what feature area a specific feature request belongs to. The product champion can then selectively read and process only the feedback from the most popular feature areas. This prioritization methodology makes it far more likely that the feature requests they upvote in the FSOR are representative of the most requested ones. For an example of this at work, consider what the LinkedIn Sales Navigator team did. They had a huge volume of customer support tickets coming in. However, their product champion for customer support could only dedicate 1 to 2 hours per week to processing these tickets into FSOR upvotes. To help the customer support product champion manage all this volume, they created a 2-layer categorization system. The first layer of labeling was for type of feedback. They categorized customer support tickets into 3 broad ticket types: feature request, UX issue, and bug. This first layer of categorization helped the product champion only look at relevant feature request tickets. The second layer of categorization sorted each ticket into 14 distinct feature areas. These areas each represented a different part of the LinkedIn Sales Navigator product, from feed to profile to accounts. This allowed the product champion to see what feature areas had the most feature requests. They prioritized feature areas with the highest number of feature requests in each review, making it more likely that the tickets they processed into feature requests for the FSOR were representative of the most requested features. The final challenge is motivating other teams to participate in the FSOR updating process. We recommend framing feedback processing for the FSOR as the primary channel through which other teams can influence product direction. Sachin says, often, teams like customer support and sales are really interested in influencing the direction of the product. The key is to make sure that they feel heard and that their work is actually shaping the product. Consider how the product team at LinkedIn got buy-in from other teams to update the FSOR. First, they framed the FSOR as the primary way for other teams to give feedback. They noted that the product team looked at the FSOR on a bi-weekly basis to help calibrate what feature requests to prioritize, meaning the best way to get features prioritized was to show the quantitative request data for it on the FSOR. Additionally, they invited cross-functional representatives from sales and customer support to attend those bi-weekly meetings to make sure that other teams' feedback was being heard. Representatives were required to update the FSOR with data from their respective feedback sources beforehand, creating a clear incentive for tagging. In the meeting itself, the product team helped teams feel like they were being heard. Representatives could be in the room while feature prioritization decisions were being made. For feature requests that were deprioritized, they could directly hear from and discuss the rationale with the PM team. Finally, when announcing feature releases, the product team would credit the teams that updated that request in the FSOR, reinforcing the idea that the FSOR was the primary channel for input. Together, these behavior reinforcement mechanisms helped keep the FSOR accurate and useful, giving the PM team a key tool to calibrate their intuition. That concludes setting up your FSOR. You now have the knowledge to set up and run both key feedback management systems, enabling you to efficiently build your product intuition. In the next lesson, we'll cover the nuances involved in using these systems to develop your product intuition.